Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear participants. I'm happy to introduce the first three speakers of this section, Syntax 2, and I will keep myself only brief. I just want to say hello from this little town in Germany called Berlin. And yeah, I will be the chair, and we start with the first talk, and it's a talk by Xiao Lu. I hope that I pronounce it in the right way, from Stanford University, entitled Reducing Conjunct Islands to Adjunct Islands, Evidence from Turkish. Thank you very much for coming. Please start.
Thanks. I have a handout, and here's the link to the handout I'm posting in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see it. So you can follow along if you prefer, like we would otherwise be doing in normal times. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. And maybe I can also share the screen so that you know like where I'm at on the handout. All right. Okay.
And just to make
see
that we don't have any feedback echo, so please just mute your microphones, except of the speaker, of course.
Okay, so I guess we'll just start. So in Turkish, verbal coordination can be achieved through two different coordinators, a standalone coordinator called ve, or a bound morpheme ip. In ve coordination, as shown here in 1, the coordinator ve is situated between the two conjuncts. In ip coordination, in contrast, the coordinator ip is attached to the left conjunct verb as a bound morpheme. This is shown in 2. So we see that in this case, ip is attached to the left conjunct verb git, so to form a complex set git ip. As we know, conjuncts are usually islands cross-linguistically, and this generalization is called the element constraint. So it's part of the coordinate structure constraint, basically stating that conjuncts are islands that blocks movements. The conjuncts in ve coordination are no exception. So Turkish is a W-in-situ language, and island blocks the covert movement of adjunct W-in-situs, and this is exactly the case in ve coordination. The W scope dependency of in-situ W adjuncts cannot cross conjunct boundaries. So an example of that would be 3 on the next page. So the adjunct W-in-situ word, in this case nazil, meaning how, cannot originate inside. So now like it's easier to see. So nazil cannot originate inside either conjunct while taking matrix scope. So in 3a, nazil is inside the left conjunct, taking matrix scope, that's ungrammatical. In the second sentence 3b, nazil is inside the second conjunct, the right conjunct, and taking matrix scope, also ungrammatical. Now let's turn to ip coordination. It presents an interesting exception to the element constraint. So it contrasts with ve coordination in that the rightmost conjunct, or the right conjunct, the final conjunct in ip coordination, is not an island for extraction. It presents an exception to element constraint. So we see that in 4a, we have covert movement from the left conjunct as basically the same pattern as we saw earlier in ve coordination. But interestingly, if we have nazil embedded in the right conjunct, in 4b, the sentence is grammatical. This study has 2 goals, sort of intertwined. First, I'll try to explain the partial absence of element constraint in ip coordination, basically the lack of islandhood of the right conjunct or the final conjunct. And also we'll try to understand the differences between the 2 types of verbal coordination, the ip and ve coordination structures in Turkish. I propose that ip coordination is best analyzed as a junction structure. So it's been proposed by people for coordination in English and other languages, with the left conjunct adjoined to the right conjunct, or non-final conjuncts adjoined to the final conjunct. So the structure is in 5. We see the NP is adjoined to the right conjunct, and the right conjunct is basically the causal spine. And from this structure, we can reduce the islandhood of the left conjunct to adjunct island constraint. And ve coordination is a bit more complicated. I propose that ve coordination involves symmetric mutual adjunction between the conjuncts. So it's actually something that has been proposed a long time ago by Robert May in his 85 book, and also more recently by a manuscript by Ad Neeleman and Misako Tanaka just last year. And in this proposal, the whole coordinate structure is basically a segment of both conjuncts, and both conjuncts are considered adjuncts, and therefore we can also derive the islandhood of both basically from adjunct island constraint. In the next two sections, we shall examine the IP and Vape coordination respectively, and after that, we will turn to the connection to English coordinate structure and see what implications our analyses have for element constraint in general in section 4. So now let's go to section 2. This is page 3. The goal of this section is to explain the partial lack of element constraint in IP coordination, or the lack of islandhood of the right conjunct. This is seen earlier in example 4, and now I have it repeated here as example 7. So nozzle can only originate in the right conjunct, but now the left. And also this extends to other division C2 adjuncts like Nizaman, what time, or when, as seen in 8. So it's basically the same pattern. To account for this, I propose that the left conjunct is adjoining to the right, while the right conjunct is not really a conjunct anymore, but rather the causal spine. Adopting the standard assumption about Turkish clause structure, the structure of IP coordination I propose is shown here in 9, enlarged handout so you can see it. The left conjunct is an adjunct, given that adjuncts are islands in Turkish, as shown in 10. So these are examples showing adjunct island constraint. It blocks the covert movement of WH adjuncts, while the right conjunct is larger and it covers the causal spine, and there's no reason to think that it blocks WH movement. Now I will show 3 pieces of independent evidence for this adjunction analysis of IP coordination. Basically, lexical stress pattern, placement of T and S morpheme, and the lack of tense and aspect mismatch between the two conjuncts, and also extraposition of the left conjunct. The first piece of evidence comes from lexical stress pattern. In this section, we will show that the right conjunct V forms a complex head with matrix T and asp. The left conjunct V forms a complex head with IP. And thus, the right conjunct is part of the matrix and is larger in size, and the left conjunct is smaller, and it doesn't include T and asp. There are 2 assumptions to this argument. First, it has been shown that lexical stress and the last syllable of the phonological word in Turkish receives lexical stress, and complex heads maps to the boundaries of phonological words in PF. And therefore, the last syllable of complex head formed through cyclic head movement should receive lexical stress. An example of this is shown in 11. Second, assuming the adjunction analysis of IP coordination, so recall the structure in 9 on previous page, where V is in both conjuncts, V in both conjuncts undergo cyclic head movement. The left conjunct V moves up to IP, and further movement is blocked, is disrupted because of the adjunction. And the right conjunct V should move all the way up to matrix T and asp, as in regular sentences, given that the right conjunct is basically the causal spine, and nothing disrupts the head movement. Based on these 2 pieces of information, we should predict the lexical stress of complex head to fall on IP and the last syllable of matrix T, which turn out to be exactly the case as shown in 12. Structure 13 on the next page here is showing the exact same thing. It's more straightforward. So basically, lexical stress falls on the last syllable of the 2 complex heads. And this is these boxes show like where the complex heads are as predicted by the adjunction analysis. The second piece of independent evidence is the lack of T and asp morpheme on the left conjunct verb, and its mandatory lack of T and asp morpheme. Assuming the adjunction analysis, the left conjunct V cannot have T or asp morphology, simply because they're above the level of adjunction, and the right conjunct should always receive T and asp morphology through head movement. And this is indeed the case, as shown in 14. Overt T and asp morpheme on the left conjunct, even if they're the same as those on the right conjunct, so having matching T and asp, the sentence will still be ungrammatical. So we see like gider ip or giti ip or gider the ip. These are all not possible. The only possible thing is gidip. And furthermore, the adjunction analysis also predicts that the tangent aspect of the right conjunct should dictate the tangent aspect of the left conjunct, since the right conjunct T and asp are the matrix T and asp that scopes over both conjuncts, because the right conjunct is larger and basically encompasses the entire causal spine. And this is true, as shown in 15. 15A and B shows that the temporal adverb dun, yesterday, is compatible with the past progressive tense aspect, but not with the present progressive tense aspect. So 15A is okay, 15B is not okay. In C, we have an ip coordinate structure where dun is inside the left conjunct, even though there's no overt tense or aspect morphology present in the left conjunct. But the sentence is still infelicitous if the right conjunct tense and aspect is in conflict with the left conjunct adverb dun. So what this is showing is that there cannot be a mismatch between the two conjuncts in tense and aspect, and the left conjunct tense and aspect is mandatorily the same as the right conjunct. Basically, the right this is in line with the adjunction analysis. Moving on to the third piece of independent evidence, if the left conjunct is an adjunct, it should be able to be extraposed. And this is attested in 16A, where the left conjunct ishik dip, in this case, go to work, is moved to the sentence final position. This sentence is somehow degraded, according to my informants, but still significantly better than the Vape Coordination counterpart in 16B. So if you try to move, extrapose the left conjunct along with Vape to the right of the right conjunct in Vape Coordination, the sentence is somehow much worse. To summarize, so far we see that ip coordination is best analyzed as an adjunction structure where the left conjunct is an adjunct and the right conjunct is the causal spine. And this is supported by the islandhood of the left conjunct, but not the right. The lexical stress pattern we saw, placement of asp and T morpheme, the lack of tense and aspect mismatch, and finally the extraposition of the left conjunct. Now let's turn to section 3, Vape Coordination. The goal of this section is to account for the islandhood of both conjuncts in Vape Coordination, which is shown again here in 17 and 18. Again, the in situ adjuncts Nazil and Nizaman cannot take matrix scope if the surface inside either one of the Vape conjuncts. To account for this pattern, I propose that Vape coordination involves mutual symmetric adjunction of both conjuncts, which is basically based on similar analyses of English coordination by May 85 and Needleman and Tanaka 2020. I'll go into details of what mutual adjunction means. But let's start with a regular adjunction. So regular adjunction, when XP is adjoined to YP, assuming the segment theory of adjunction, we have a new segment of the adjoined to category, in this case YP, created. And so that is the resulting node. And the resulting node and the adjoined to node is part of the same category. So in other words, the adjoined to category projects. So extending that to mutual adjunction, what does it mean by mutual adjunction? So in this case, we see XP1 and XP2 adjoins to each other. So in this case, both XP1 and XP2 are adjuncts, and both XP1 and XP2 are adjoined to category. So in a sense, they both project. And the resulting node is a segment shared by both XP1's category and XP2 category. So the categories are marked by the boxes here. You might have noticed that the coordinator V is not structurally represented here. There are several options, like based on the previous literature, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A session, but I'm not committed to any one of those, given the present data. But in a nutshell, the structure proposal for Vape coordination is shown in 21. We have a symmetric structure, and both conjuncts are basically adjuncts. And I will present two pieces of independent evidence in support of the structural symmetry and the adjuncthood of the conjuncts. One is the failure of negative Concord item licensing, and the other is the quantifier scope, basically the failure of quantifier scoping in Vape coordination. So first, let's look at the failure of negative Concord item licensing. Turkish is a strict negative Concord language. So we have negative Concord items or NCIs, and they need to be licensed by sentential negation through agree. So this is shown in 22. Examples of NCIs are hiç kimse or kimse, that has to be licensed by negation. So 22, hiç kimse and kimse are licensed by sentential negation gitmedi. So may the negation license it. In 22b, without that licenser, NCIs are not possible. Interestingly, NCI licensing fails when an adjunct boundary intervenes in between NCI and negation. So in 23, that shows like 3 different types of adjunct clauses block licensing of NCI when the negation is outside the adjunct and NCI is inside the adjunct. Note that 23a, you might have noticed, is basically an IP coordination that we have previously analyzed as an adjunct. So I'm just adopting that analysis here. The fact that in this case, IP conjunct behaves the same as other types of adjuncts in blocking NCI licensing provides further evidence for an adjunction analysis from the previous section. But let's focus on IP now, for Vape now. So with that in mind, with the fact that adjunction or adjunct clauses block NCI licensing in mind, we can, and before we look at Vape coordination, there's another caveat, which people may think that the fact that 23 A, B, and C are ungrammatical might be that NCI simply cannot exist in the adjunct clauses, but that's not the case. In 24, we see that NCI can still be licensed inside an adjunct as long as the negation is also inside the adjunct. So according to the mutual adjunction analysis, both conjuncts are adjuncts in Vape coordination, and they should behave the same as other types of adjuncts in blocking NCI licensing. And that is indeed attested. That's shown in 25. Basically, hiç kimse and kimse cannot exist in either conjunct of Vape coordination if the negation is outside. Moving on to section 3.2, page 11. This section shows how quantifier scope pattern in Vape coordination supports a mutual adjunction analysis. Recall the structure from the previous section about symmetric adjunction structure. So shown here again as 26. Assuming again the segment theory of adjunction, the top node is a segment of both XP1 and XP2. If we have the definition of exclusion as X excludes Y, if and only if no segment of X dominates Y, then basically applying it to structure 26, we see that XP1 and XP2 do not exclude each other. And also following the definition of secament in 27, X secaments Y if and only if X and Y are categories and X excludes Y, and every category that dominates X dominates Y, we see that there's no secament relation between XP1 and XP2, given that they do not exclude each other due to the shared top node as a segment of both categories. We have an interesting implication that basically there's no secament relation between the conjuncts, and anything that any syntactic relation that depends on a secament relation should not hold in between. So that makes things like quantifier scoping interesting. Further, note that Turkish is a scope rigid language. So this is where it's different from languages like English. So the scope of quantifiers are established by the surface position of quantifiers. So there's no like covert raising options to raise the scope as in English. So this sort of makes the picture simpler. Turning to Vape coordination, we should expect that when one of the conjunct is a quantifier, it should not scope over the other conjunct or anything inside the other conjunct. And this is attested in 29 and 30 on the next page, on page 12. We see that when the left conjunct is a quantifier, hiç erkek, every boy, the universal quantifier, it cannot scope over the other conjunct when the other conjunct is an existential. So the only interpretation of this sentence is that every boy and one single girl come inside. So the interpretation, which is available in Chinese, in English, where the universal quantifier scope over the existential, basically for every boy, he came inside with a different girl. This is not possible in Turkish. Similar pattern is shown if we reverse the order of the conjuncts. The right conjunct can also not scope over the left conjunct. That's shown in 30. So the prediction bornes out. Quantifier scoping relation does not hold between the two conjuncts, even though they seem that there should be some C-commanding relation. There isn't. Just to summarize, in this section, we saw that Vape coordination is best analyzed as mutual junction structure, and the analysis is supported by the islandhood of both conjuncts, the blockage of NCI licensing by conjuncts, and finally, the failure of quantifier scoping. In sum, we saw that Vape coordination and Vape coordination involves qualitatively different structures. Vape coordination involves asymmetric junction, and Vape coordination is best analyzed as a mutual symmetric junction. This derives the intriguing islandhood pattern we saw in the beginning. So basically, anything that has been analyzed as an adjunct demonstrated islandhood. So we no longer need to state element constraint as a separate constraint, but rather it's reduced to adjunct island constraint. How does this help us understand element constraint in general? It is likely that exceptions to element constraint also involve different structures from EC abiding coordinations cross-linguistically, not only in Turkish. So there are quite a few exceptions to the element constraint attested cross-linguistically. And some of the English examples dates back to Hash-Ross's dissertation. So one famous example of element constraint exception is the so-called type A coordination, type A exception to element constraint, based on the terminology by Lakoff, 86. So examples are, what did he go to the store and buy? What did he enter the room and say? So these are quite intriguing exceptions. We see that extraction from the right conjunct is possible. It has been generalized that extraction from the left conjunct is not possible. Which store did he go to and buy the cake? Which room did he enter and say hello? These are labeled star by Lakoff and somehow degraded, comparing to 31 A and B. So in a way, these sentences are suspiciously similar to if coordination in that they also show asymmetric conjunct islandhood. And semantically, they also convey a temporal sequence between conjuncts. I haven't mentioned this, but if coordination has this type of interpretation, either semantically or pragmatically, that the left conjunct precedes the right conjunct temporally. So it is possible that maybe type A coordination also involve a different structure comparing to regular coordination in English, in the same way that IP coordination is different structurally from Vape coordination in Turkish. If we pay more attention to this fine structure of this I guess I'm running out of time, but I'm happy to talk more about type A coordination in the Q&A session if anyone is interested. Okay, thanks.
To unmute. Seche, thank you so much for your nice talk. Very interesting. I was very, we just start with the discussion because we are a little bit run out of time. And please ask your questions, and maybe you can manage it yourself this session, because I sometimes don't see the requests and answers. So if anybody wants to ask something, please ask now. The discussion is now open. So
I saw a question. Does IP coordination behave differently from Vape coordination with respect to NCI licensing and quantifier scoping? So as I said, in IP coordination, the left conjunct blocks NCI licensing. The right conjunct doesn't. So that's one. As for quantifier scoping, as you have noticed, I've been using DP coordination in Vape coordination to show the quantifier scoping, because in verbal coordination, the conjuncts are simply just too large. So in Vape coordination, as I showed, I think the level of coordination is at TP rather than little VP or POP as in IP coordination. So negation is mandatorily inside the conjunct. So that's hard to show. So I have to reduce the size of the conjunct. So that's basically why it's so hard to compare the quantifier scoping data between IP and Vape coordination, given that they are also different sizes conjuncts. But there is a contrast in NCI licensing.
Okay, further questions? We still have time. At least 5 minutes we have time for discussion. 5 more minutes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about example 15, IP coordination. And I was wondering, given your analysis, which is IP, the first conjunct contains something smaller than an SP, maybe a little VP. I'm just wondering if the first conjunct can contain high adjuncts, like temporal adjuncts, even when the tense does match with the second conjunct.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's something I worried about at first. So basically, you're asking what happens if instead of dun we have like maybe yes today, which is a temporal adjunct adverb compatible with present progressive. Would the sentence still be ungrammatical? Actually, I asked this tested that sentence. I didn't show it here. So Hasan Bagun, which is today, markete ketip, and okula gidiyor. And that sentence is rated as acceptable, perfectly fine by my informants, which is pretty intriguing, considering that I do have a lot of evidence showing that like the left conjunct simply doesn't contain TP or SP. So I guess that's like, I don't have quite a good explanation for why that is. So maybe the attachment size for some of these adverbs are different in Turkish, or yeah, so that's intriguing indeed. Yeah, but there is a contrast. So if the left conjunct, instead of having dun here, we have bagun today, the sentence is okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice question, very nice answer. Let's go forward. Actually, I would have one, but I just wait until others are asking. So if not, I would like to ask one question. As we know, Turkish is a SOV language, so the verb is always finite verb is in the, and I would just like to ask you if you have any coordination data where you have the verb and you just combine it, and then you have ellipse, some kind of yeah, silent syntax. If you can have it as a proof that one of those items that sorry of your interesting assumptions will hold still. So concretely, if you have two coordinated clauses where you have also adjuncts, and the verb in one case has to be in the left conjunct, and in other cases maybe in the right, or is there any so equivalent distribution between that? So I mean cases of sluicing or something like that, or even gapping.
Yeah, I haven't looked into any data
Okay.
involving ellipses, gapping, sluicing.
Yeah.
That's indeed an interesting. I'm not sure. So, do you have a sort of a concrete example in mind? So, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but are you so
you had
that's been
from English, you know, you had some very good examples from English where you can see that if you have two verbs, one in the left conjunct, the other in the right, you can not always just, in some cases, it's not licensed if the verb is a special kind of, one is transitive, one is not transitive, and things like that. So this was what I'm talking about, you know. Right? So because of this strict word order, you know, you have still some kind of, you know, it's more strict than in Russian. For example, in Russian, we have quite free word order, and then we can, but we cannot do any, we cannot always delete everything. We just have to have special elements are really to have, like, you know, Schwarzschild kind of, you know, Jason Merchant has written about it. So some kinds of have to be the head, some of the heads have to stay if you have coordination, and then consumption reduction or something like that, you know. This is what
yeah. So we would expect, so for example, in Vape Coordination, if like we think basically the two conjuncts are symmetric and there's no C-commanding relation.
Yes.
I'm not sure like how exactly. So it should predict that if, for example, the licensing of ellipses or silencing of any part of the second conjunct is depends on like the preceding structure in a higher position,
Yeah.
then that should fail.
Yeah.
But also, as I said, like there might be further. I mean, so the one way out of that is to say that maybe the licensing of ellipses is not dependent on like structural prominence. But I haven't looked into any data of how that applies to.
Do you mean now linear prominence or structure? I mean, do you mean
structural prominence?
Structural, yeah, okay.
Yeah, but in any case, there has to be a linear prominence, right?
Thank you so much for participation in the discussion, Danfeng Wu, and all people who have listened to your very nice talk. I really liked it, and just go on with the good work. And we are now proceeding with the next talk. Thank you so much again. Senche, I will say it in Chinese, in Mandarin. Okay, it means thank you. So this is the only thing that I can say. But then we have the next talk by Augie. Correct me if I have bad pronunciation. Sorry. Augie Kim from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and Sulky Park from Kyung-hee University. And this talk is about the double life of Korean Mes-ul. Sorry, I can't speak Korean. But with a reason WH adverb and an instrumental WH nominal. Thank you so much for coming. And yeah, start with your presentation, please.
Our presentation is about island sensitivity of standard and non-standard WH in situ in Korean. Introduction. Since Huang 1982, it has been well known that WH in situ languages like Chinese exhibit an argument-adjunct asymmetry regarding island sensitivity. For example, in Chinese, WH argument 什么 what can occur inside a complex NP island, as in 1A. But as in 1B, WH adjunct 为什么 why is sensitive to the island. However, such asymmetry becomes more complicated when we consider 为什么 asymmetry in island sensitivity. As shown in 2, unlike reason 为什么, purpose 为了什么 for what does not exhibit island effect, even though the two are WH adjunct. To account for such asymmetries in island effect, many researchers have argued that the island behaviors of in situ WH phrases fall under the noun versus adverb generalization in 3. An in situ WH phrase is island insensitive if and only if it is or contains a WH nominal. The Dnag easily captures the contrast in 1. 什么 is island insensitive since it is a WH nominal, but 为什么 is island sensitive because it is an adverb. The Dnag also explains why purpose 为什么 is island insensitive. As you have seen here, since it has a nominal element 什么 in it. In this talk, we aim to show that the Dnag is not sufficient to explain the island behaviors of WH in situ in Korean. Alternatively, we suggest that the island sensitivity of in situ WH phrases correlate with their base positions, not their categorical status. Specifically, we propose that an in situ WH phrase is island sensitive if and only if it is base generated in the CP domain, spec CP. Standard and non-standard WH questions in Korean. Here we are concerned with canonical WH questions using 뭘, what, as in for, 미미는 뭘 읽었니? What did Mimi read? And 무엇으로, what with, as in 5. 너는 무엇으로 꽃병을 깼니? With what did you break the vase? And 어떻게, how, as in 6. 미미는 어떻게 차를 고쳤니? How did Mimi fix the car? The 3 WH phrases can be used non-standardly in that they receive why-like interpretations in certain contexts. For example, in 7, 미미는 뭘 그렇게 많은 논문을 읽었니? Why did Mimi read so many papers? In 8, 차가 있으면서 너는 무엇으로 또 차를 샀니? Although having the car, why did you buy a car again? In 9, 미미는 어떻게 미국에 가게 되었니? Why did Mimi go to America? Here, we use the W superscript to indicate the non-standard WH items. The Y-like behavior of the non-standard WH items is evidenced by their replacement with the regular WH adjunct 왜, why. In 10, 미미는 왜 그렇게 많은 논문을 읽었니? In 11, 차가 있으면서 너는 왜 또 차를 샀니? In 12, 미미는 왜 미국에 가게 되었니? Counterexamples to the NAG. If the NAG is correct, it is expected that non-standard mol is island insensitive since it is a WH nominal. However, as shown in 13, it is not the case. In 13a, 미미는 뭘 그렇게 많은 논문을 읽은 사람을 비난했니? Here, the non-standard mol cannot occur inside the complex MP island. In 13b, 미미는 킴이 뭘 그렇게 일찍 떠나서 화가 났니? Here, the non-standard mol cannot appear in the adjunct island. The NAG also has difficulty explaining the island insensitivity of WH adverb 어떻게, how, as in 13. 미미는 킴이 어떻게 요리한 음식을 먹었니? Where standard 어떻게 occurs inside the complex MP island. According to Chung 2005, the standard 어떻게 is island insensitive because it has a nominal part, the, in it, like this. If Chung's analysis is correct, then non-standard 어떻게 should be also island insensitive, since it has the same morphological form as its standard counterpart. However, as shown in 15, the non-standard 어떻게 is sensitive to the complex MP island.
As mentioned in introduction, here we show that the island behaviors of in-situ WH phrases in Korean correlate not with their categorical status, but with their base positions. Before doing so, let us briefly review Co's 2005 analysis of the base generated position of the regular WH agent 왜. Korean is well known as exhibiting the intervention effect, where a WH phrase cannot be preceded by scope-bearing elements like 만, 언니, and 아무도, anyone. For example, in 16a, the WH argument more cannot follow the scope-bearing element 미미만, but it is able to precede the scope-bearing element, as in 16b. However, unlike other WH phrases, the WH agent 왜 does not exhibit the intervention effect, in that it can follow or precede a scope-bearing element, as in 17. To account for the peculiar behaviors of 왜 in terms of the intervention effect, Co assumes that in an interactive clause, 왜 is base generated in its checking position, spec CP, whereas other WH phrases undergo LF movement to spec CP for feature checking. In particular, she takes the intervention effect as a LF constraint on WH movement, where a WH phrase cannot be attracted to its checking position across a scope-bearing element. According to her analysis, 16a, 미미만 뭘 읽었니, is ungrammatical because the scope-bearing element blocks LF movement of the WH argument to its checking position, as in 19a. On the other hand, 17a, 미미만 왜 많은 책을 읽었니, is okay because 왜 does not move at LF, as it is licensed in its base generate position, spec CP, as in 20a. The external merge of the WH agent 왜 in spec CP is supported by the fact that 왜 always scopes over negation. For example, in 21, 자는 왜 메리를 좋아하지 않니? Here, 왜 only has the wide scope reading over negation, like what is the reason X, such that John does not like Mary. The base generation of 왜 in the CP domain is also supported by the fact that epistemic adverbs cannot precede the double-edged adjunct where, as in 22a. Since the epistemic adverbs cannot undergo A-bar scrambling or topicalization over complementizer C. In this study, adapting course ideas, we employ intervention effect, scopal interactions with negation, and ability to follow epistemic adverbs as diagnostic tests to detect whether a given double-edged item is base generated in SpecCP or not. As for non-standard mole, we assume that it is base generated in SpecCP as its licensing position, given that it behaves exactly like where with respect to the three diagnostics. First, it does not exhibit the intervention effect in that it is able to follow a scope-bearing element as in 23a. 미미만 뭘 그렇게 많은 책을 읽었니? Second, it has an obligatory wide scope reading over negation as in 24. 좌는 뭘 그렇게 쉽게 뒤지지도 않니? This sentence is interpreted only as what is the reason X such that John does not get tired so easily. Third, epistemic adverbs cannot precede non-standard mole, like the regular double-edged adjunct where. As to island sensitivity of non-standard mole, we have already seen that it is island sensitive, just like where, as in 26. However, its standard counterpart, namely double-edged argument, is island free, as shown in 27, where the double-edged argument mole can appear in the complex MP island, as in 27a, and in the adjunct island, as in 27b. Based on the observations we have made so far, we can say that standard mole, which is base generated below CP, specifically in the little pp domain, is island insensitive, whereas non-standard mole, base generated in SpecCP, is island sensitive. We also assume that non-standard 어떻게 is externally merged in SpecCP, in that it is able to follow scope-bearing elements, as in 28a, 미미만 어떻게 미국에 가게 되었니? It necessarily scopes over negation, as in 29, and it is unable to follow epistemic adverbs, as in 30. I'm gonna skip this slide. In Korean, unlike the double-edged adjunct where, standard manner or instrumental 어떻게 exhibit the negative island effect, as in 33b. 미미는 어떻게 차를 고치지 않았니? Which is ungrammatical. This indicates that unlike the double-edged adjunct where, manner or instrumental 어떻게 is base generated below negation phrase. Meantime, non-standard 어떻게 does not exhibit the negative island effect, just like the double-edged adjunct where, since it is externally merged in SpecCP. So example 34, 미미는 어떻게 차를 고치지 않게 되었니? is okay. As for the island sensitivity of the two variants of 어떻게, we have seen that non-standard 어떻게 is island sensitive, whereas standard 어떻게 is island insensitive. The relevant examples are repeated in 35. Based on the observations so far, we can conclude that standard 어떻게, which is base generated below negation phrase, is island insensitive, whereas non-standard 어떻게, which is base generated in SpecCP, is island sensitive. Like the other non-standard double-edged phrases, non-standard Mosro is assumed to originate in SpecCP. As shown in 36a, scope-bearing elements can precede non-standard Mosro. 미미만 Mos로 또 일본에 갔니? As in 37, Non-standard Moser always has a wide scope reading over negation. As in 38, epistemic adverbs cannot precede non-standard Moser. We assume that, unlike non-standard Moser, standard instrumental Moser is base-generated below negation phrase, in that it is sensitive to the negative island, as evidenced by the ungrammatical example 39a. 너는 멋으로 학교에 가지 않았니? Meanwhile, non-standard 멋으로 is not subject to the negative island effect, as we have seen in 37 here, because it is base generated in CP. As for island effects, unlike standard instrumental 멋으로, non-standard with 멋으로 is island sensitive, as in 40. 40a, 너는 자네 멋으로 또 꾸민 방을 좋아하니? Here, the non-standard 멋으로 cannot appear in the complex MP island, but its standard counterpart can appear in the island, as in 40b. Based on the observations so far, we can say that standard 멋으로 base generated below negation phrase is island insensitive, whereas non-standard 멋으로 base generated in spec CP is island sensitive. The other double-edged phrases that we have not discussed so far, such as who and low double-edged agents like when and where, are all island insensitive, as shown in 41. 41a, 자는 누가 요리한 음식을 먹었니? 41b, 자는 미미가 언제 요리한 음식을 먹었니? 41c, 자는 미미가 어디서 요리한 음식을 먹었니? All the island insensitive double-edged phrases presented here are known as being merged below CP. A summary. The table 1 shows the correlations between the island sensitivity and base positions of standard and non-standard double-edged items in Korean. As we can see here, a double-edged phrase base generated below CP is island insensitive, whereas a double-edged phrase base generated in the CP domain, spec CP, is island sensitive, regardless of whether the given double-edged phrase is a double-edged nominal or a double-edged adverb, a standard or a non-standard double-edged phrase. Our preliminary literature review reveals that the proposed correlation between island sensitivity and base positions may also hold for Chinese and Japanese. In Table 2, Chinese reservation mark Y is island sensitive and it is assumed to be base generated in the CP domain, but its proposed counterpart, relation mark for what is island insensitive and it is base generated below CP. And Chinese causal how is island sensitive and it is assumed to be base generated in the CP domain, but its manner counterpart is island insensitive and it is base generated below CP. And also Jamea how is island insensitive and it is base generated below CP. Other double-edged phrases are all island insensitive and they are assumed to be base generated below CP. In Japanese, 나제 Y is island sensitive and it is assumed to be base generated in the CP domain, but its proposed counterpart, this one is island insensitive and it is base generated below CP. And also Japanese how is island insensitive and it is base generated below CP, and also other double-edged phrases are all island insensitive and they are base generated below CP. Conclusion. In this study, we have shown that the energy is not sufficient to explain the island behaviors of standard and non-standard double-edged items in Korean. And we have proposed that the island sensitivity of standard and non-standard in situ double-edged phrases closely correlates with their base positions. Specifically, we have proposed that an in-situ double-edged phrase is island sensitive if and only if it originates in the CP domain, spec CP. However, we do not yet have an account of why and how the island sensitivity of standard and non-standard in-situ double-edged phrases correlates with their base positions. Reference. Thank you.
It's called webinar. No, very nice talk. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. Also, the comparison between Mandarin and Korean. I can speak a little bit Mandarin, but not Korean. I have to learn it. Anyway, we start with the discussion. We have 7 minutes or 8 minutes for discussion. Please ask your questions. And it would be maybe better if you take over. You just organize the answers and questions. Yeah?
And sorry for the video quality.
Oh,
and,
no problem. No
yeah,
problem.
we didn't expect that. So let us share the slide first.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that.
So,
yeah, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions?
No, I mean, islands are actually my favorite. Yeah.
Oh.
But I don't want to dominate it. I just want to look whether people show up who want to ask questions, who are maybe even more like, who know Korean at least, who like to ask questions if I don't know the language.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like just to cite data like many of my colleagues do from others, and then there are so many mistakes. Even if I found many mistakes in some important work on Italian, even this is terrible.
Yeah.
And I know that, I mean, island effects are always a little bit very sensitive to judgments as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So even for native speakers, so that's why just maybe the major hypothesis is very interesting.
Can you move to the slide for other languages?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes.
So
that people can see it.
So yeah, what is maybe also important?
Yeah, here you can see it here, slide 5. Here, the blue one. Can you see this? So an in-situ double phrase is island sensitive only and if if it is space generated in the CP domain. Here, spec CP, if and only if.
What I didn't quite get, maybe I didn't get examples whether or not Korean has the same property that it has in situ WH first merge.
So do you want to see the data in other languages?
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
I didn't quite get whether it has the same like Shenmei, where you have it in the.
How about this one then in Chinese? This expression.
But whether in Korean it has also just movement first. It just merged, and then you have a LF movement.
Yes, yeah. Here I adopt LF movement approach. Yeah.
Okay. So the element here would be Zen. How do you pronounce it? Zenme?
Maybe yeah, we don't speak Chinese, but maybe.
This is Chinese. Okay.
Yeah. In terms of WH.
Okay. Are there any people who can comment on these languages, because also important, of course.
In terms of WH in situ, Chinese and Korean is similar to Chinese and Japanese. So if you are a Chinese or Japanese speaker,
I've been told that as to the family, it's very exceptional family. Actually, Korean doesn't have any correspondence in any other. It's a little bit like Cartwheelian in the way that it doesn't have any.
Yeah.
It's not a like Chinese. It has a special family. So it's I don't know how to explain it. Just I don't know. There are no people who are questions. So maybe send me this paper. I would really very much like to discuss it with my colleague who is on our editorial board of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, it sounds great. Yeah.
She comes from Seoul University.
Yeah.
I would like just to maybe to work on it with WH questions in running. But
Sorry
does
to
anybody
interrupt,
have
but I
questions?
saw a question from
Yeah.
Japan. Sorry.
Questions for
There
you,
was a
right?
question, does Korean have the same distinction between causal and manner how as Chinese? If so, does this affect the island sensitivity of how?
Yeah, actually.
Mhm.
So also in Korean, as we have discussed, Korean how 어떻게 can be used as a reason at WC adverbial, like for example,
Yeah.
just canonical example one.
Table is
Sorry.
good.
Sorry. Yeah, maybe 9. 미미는 어떻게 미국에 가게 되었니? So in this case, this 어떻게 is just only interpreted as a reason WC adverbial, but also it can be interpreted as a just canonical manner or instrumental WC adverbial in other contexts.
Mhm.
So like Chinese, yeah.
But I didn't quite get, does it have this island effects like adjunct negative, adjunct islands effects? Does it
So
have-
yeah, so we discussed here, actually in this case, non-standard 어떻게, I mean reason 어떻게 is island sensitive, but
Okay.
manner or just standard manner or instrumental 어떻게 is island insensitive, like Chinese.
Yeah.
Chinese Jamma. Yeah.
Okay, so we have still 3 minutes to go. Nobody wants to ask any
Okay,
questions?
can you move
Can I
to the
ask,
slides,
It's
the
here.
table for
Yeah.
Chinese and Japanese? Yeah, I think that would be nicer to show.
Table was good.
The table, I mean,
The table was,
table.
if you can take us, yeah, this the colored table. There was a nice table chart. Yeah, this one.
Yeah,
Just see the differences between. Yeah, okay.
here you can easily recognize the distinction between
My student, by the way, Stepan.
and other
Potsdam.
cases like manner or instrumental.
He's now in Nova Gorica, Stepanov, you know it, in
Mhm.
Slovenia, teaching there. So actually, yeah, I think we should, the problem is always, we don't speak the language, but I think that it's very interesting, this comparison between Chinese and Korean and Japanese. And
Mhm.
Can I jump in and ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
Sure.
Yeah. So your argument is based on the Huang data about Chinese, the adjunct argument of symmetry. So there's an interesting data point that it has been experimentally tested that actually the adjunct argument of symmetry in island sensitivity in Chinese is not really a symmetry in island sensitivity, but rather it's possible that there's a difference between long distance Y covert movement versus long distance WH argument covert movement. Yeah. So even in I guess like I don't know Korean, but what implications might have, I guess I'm a bit curious about that.
Yeah. So sorry, could you say that again? I mean, what is your point here?
Yeah, so I guess like, is it possible that the difference you're showing between like different types of WH adjuncts versus also the difference between WH adjuncts and WH arguments in island sensitivity is really a main effect in like how those movements work across clausal boundary, but not only island boundary, but also
I see. Yeah. Actually here we are just concerned with just only 2 major islands like complex MP islands and adjunct islands. Yeah, I think that's a good point to end. Yeah.
So if you have
Here's another question.
Yeah.
And do any of the Korean Y elements interact with embedded clauses like English Y, which is able to associate with either the metrics or the embedded clause, or do they work like Reishama or English how come, which can only associate with the clause they are located in? And English how come, meaning why, right?
Actually in Korean, where Y can associate with
either with matrix clause and or embedded clause, like English, and also like, yeah. So maybe both associations are available. I mean, embedded and matrix clause.
Just
Very-
I don't we don't know about Chinese, but
Yeah,
in
we
the case of how come case.
But as far as I know, English how come is only associated with a matrix clause, unlike English Y.
It would be a very good idea to put your forces together in
Right.
Jiangsu and make something about Korean, Chinese together about this.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Open case. Thank you so much. Wonderful
Thank you.
talk till now. And we will have another talk. Thank you so much again. And
Thank
now
you.
we will start with the third talk by Daniel Brodkin from University of California, Santa Cruz. I'm very interested also in this talk. It's about, and now I see which language it is, WH movement in Mandarin. I didn't even expect it that you are working with Austronesian languages. So I'm speaking a little bit Jakarta, Indonesian, but I don't know whether it is very near to this. So I'm very interested in your talk. Thank you so much, and start please.
All right, thanks everybody. So I am Dan Brodkin, I'm from Santa Cruz, and I'm here today to talk about pseudoclefts. I've shared a link to a handout in the chat, and I'm now going to share my screen. So you should all be able to see a handout right now.
Okay.
Okay, so once again, I'm Dan Brodkin, I'm from UC Santa Cruz, and I'm talking about today a parametric link, or a claimed one, between operations which underlie word order and operations which form argument questions. So an argument question, to define this term, is a question which targets a nominal argument, something like, what did you buy? We can contrast this with an adjunct question like, how did you buy it, or where did you buy it? And there are two sort of common strategies to form argument questions that recur cross-linguistically. One, which we sort of classically call WH movement, I'll be referring to as direct displacement. This is a structure where a WH word, an argument WH word, moves from a thematic position. So something like, what did you buy? The WH just displaces from a base position. Another way to form an argument question is with a pseudocleft. So in this sort of construction, which I've sort of drawn in three, you could imagine that the WH word is part of a predicate, a copular clause, the subject of which is a free relative or headless relative or relative clause with a dummy head. So something like, what is what you bought, or what is the thing that you bought? The analysis of these is not entirely innocent, but a sort of reasonable hypothesis for their shape in many languages is one where the WH word is part of the predicate. So the what here. The subject is a headless relative or a relative clause with a dummy head, like the thing you bought. And then the WH word undergoes predicate movement to an initial position to give the order of what is what you got, or what's the thing that you got. Now, WH pseudoclefts are very common in verb initial languages. And in fact, this distribution has led to a sort of macro parametric generalization that attempts to link a process which underlies word order to the availability of different types of argument question. So specifically, it's been claimed that languages that show verb initial word order, that derive this order through an operation of phrasal movement or predicate fronting, do not have direct displacement of WH words in content questions. And as a result, all argument questions in these languages involve WH pseudoclefts. Now, this has been sort of cashed out in a variety of ways, but the generalization exists. And today I'm going to show that there is a counterexample, and this is really not a generalization that is terribly strict. There's probably not a macro parametric link between an operation of predicate fronting underlying word order and a ban on direct displacement of argument WH words. So let me, change to continuous scroll. Okay, so why have people thought this to begin with? Let me just explain that. Well, Austronesian languages, the languages of the Austronesian family, have provided some sort of empirical motivation for this link. So the Austronesian family is enormous and diverse, and several sort of genetically and spatially very distantly related subgroups show a set of common patterns. A verb initial word order, which has been argued repeatedly to arise through predicate fronting, a ban on WH in C2, and therefore a requirement that argument WH words appear at the left edge of the clause, and apparently a ban on direct displacement, which makes all argument questions in these languages take the form of WH pseudoclefts. This is a remarkably sort of common pattern. It's been claimed to exist in like all over the Austronesian family, and has provided the sort of empirical basis for the parametric link between predicate fronting and a ban on direct displacement and a requirement for WH pseudoclefts. So I just illustrate this very briefly in Indonesian so we know what we're talking about. Indonesian is an SVO language. And nevertheless, if you want to form an argument question in this language, you need a pseudocleft. So 6 shows the form of a regular argument question in Indonesian. 6b shows an argument focus construction, which behaves the same. In both of these, we have an argument, what or that, at the left edge of the clause. The material which follows is a free relative or a headless relative. It's headed by a morpheme yang, which is a relativizer. Yeah. And we know for many reasons that this really is a pseudocleft, even though you don't see any kind of copula. So the first thing is that the WH word and focus in these constructions occupy the typical position of focused predicates. So in Indonesian, a focused predicate does appear in a clause initial position. And so we could say, well, the WH word and the focus in these constructions are just in the normal position of focused predicates. The surface morphology also tells us that this is a sort of pseudocleft. So remember that WH questions employ a morpheme yang. That yang is the thing that heads free relatives in the language. So if you want to say what he bought were snacks, you employ the same yang. So we have a morphological parallel between free relatives and argument WH questions and argument focus constructions. So it looks like a pseudocleft, and it definitely is a pseudocleft. You can insert a copula in these things. So it's clear that this involves some sort of copular structure. A WH word is predicated against a free relative in a copular clause. And so 11 just sort of shows what you might think the syntax of this thing is. You have a free relative, that's the subject. Here you can see my cursor. The WH word is part of a predicate phrase, and it is moving to an initial position as an operation of predicate fronting. So this is not movement of a WH word from a thematic position, it's predicate fronting in a copular clause. So that's an argument, that's a WH pseudocleft in Indonesian. And the same sort of analysis, the same diagnostics could be trotted out in many other Austronesian languages, specifically those in the Philippines and Madagascar, but we see the same patterns in Taiwan, and they've been argued to recur in Oceanic. You have a WH word followed by a relativizer in an argument question, and the whole thing is some sort of pseudocleft. So this is why people have claimed there is a sort of parametric link between verb initial word order, predicate fronting, and the absence of direct displacement. It's a very consistent pattern in Austronesian. Nevertheless, there is an exception. There's probably a whole little family of exceptions on the island of Sulawesi. So today I will be laying out that one clear exception in Mandar, which is an Austronesian language spoken in central Indonesia, where WH questions just do not look like pseudoclefts. So this is a verb initial language, like many other Austronesian languages, and the verb initial order in this language appears to derive from an operation of predicate fronting. I've argued for this independently in the past. I won't justify it here. We can talk about it later. But note that in 13, if you say Murni is planting flowers, you have a verb initial word order, plant flowers Murni, and if the predicate is nonverbal, it still precedes the subject. So Murni is a gardener, the predicate still precedes the subject. Let's now look at 14. 14 is an argument question in this language. What are you fishing for? There's no relativizer. There's no surface evidence that this is a pseudocleft. So what is it? Well, we could imagine two analyses. One, we could imagine that this is a sort of pseudocleft, where the WH word is a predicate, like it is in Indonesian, and the thing which follows is a sort of free relative. So this is really something like, what is what you're fishing for? We could also imagine this is just WH movement, like direct displacement of the English type. So what are you fishing for literally involves movement of an NP from an argument position to the sort of left periphery. So I will argue that the analysis in 16 is correct. This is just direct displacement. And all of the data here comes from a sort of a Mandar corpus that I've built over the past several years and elicitation that's been ongoing since 2018. You can see the corpus on the internet. You should go learn about Mandar there. Okay, so the first thing I would like to show you is that the thing which follows a WH word in an argument question in this language is in no way a free relative. Recall that this is a point of difference between the two analyses here. So if Mandar argument questions involve direct displacement, we expect this is just a clause where an argument fronts. The thing which follows the WH word is something like a TP. It's not a free relative. If it's pseudocleft, it has to be a free relative. Surface morphology tells us it's probably not a free relative. So free relatives in Mandar are headed by a morpheme anu. That's what we see in 19a. So what you cooked is spicy. There's a free relative, what you cooked. And this employs the morpheme anu, that's a relativizer. This is ungrammatical in a WH question. Now, one language from the South Sulawesi subgroup is different on this point, Selayarese, setting that aside. You cannot include the morpheme which heads a free relative in an argument question in Mondar. Moreover, you do not get the agreement pattern that you see in copular clauses. So in this language, copular clauses show agreement. So if you want to say, what are you for Halloween? You get what, agreement, and then you, the subject. Moreover, you see the same thing outside of questions. So I'm a doctor, you get doctor, agreement, I. Now, free relative subjects trigger agreement in copular clauses. So if you want to say the one who came is Javanese or the one who came is French, you have to get agreement with the free relative subject. That's this E morpheme here. So if WH questions are pseudoclefts, we predict they're copular clauses, they have a free relative subject, we predict agreement. There is no agreement. So WH argument questions do not show agreement in this language. So this is an argument that they do not actually bear a copular syntax like they do in Indonesian, and as a result, they're probably not pseudoclefts. Okay, there's several other diagnostics that suggest the same point. Another concerns causality, or the amount of structure. So in a direct displacement construction, like what did you buy? You just have one clause, right? What did you buy? That's one CP. In a pseudocleft, you actually have two clauses. You have a matrix clause, what is X, and then an embedded clause, which contains the free relative, right? So what is what you bought? There's a CP boundary in between the matrix WH word what, and the stuff which follows in the free relative, right? So that's schematized in 24a. What, and then a free relative, you fished. What is the thing you fished up? There's a clause boundary. There is demonstrably not a clause boundary in between the WH word and what follows in Mondar. This can be shown in two ways. The first is a little roundabout. Mondar has an imperative construction, an imperative form of a verb, which is just bear. So the verb is bear in an imperative. That's what you see in 25a. Take this, just take. The imperative form cannot be embedded under anything. So it's impossible to put the imperative in an embedded clause, and it's impossible to embed it under negation. So in Mondar, you can't say something like don't take it. You have to say don't that you take it, like Spanish. So the imperative morphology can only appear in a matrix clause. Now you can't try imperatives in WH questions, but recall that argument focus and argument WH questions look similar. So here's a prediction. If argument focus constructions are pseudoclefts and are biclausal, the verb in an argument focus construction should not be able to be an imperative, right? If an argument focus construction is a pseudocleft, there should be a free relative, and so the verb that we see should be embedded and should not be able to be an imperative. Now it's completely possible to have an imperative verb in a argument focus construction. So you can say build a house first. This is Mondar marriage advice, relevant to millennials. Before you build a house first before you get married. So you can have imperative morphology in an argument focus construction that tells you this thing is probably monoclausal and there's not actually a free relative here. The argument extends by analogy to WH, to argument questions. Clitic placement patterns show the same thing. So in Mondar, clitics cannot climb across clausal boundaries. So here is a sentence from a YouTube Mondar soap opera, say that you still love me. We have a bunch of clitics here on the embedded predicate. They cannot surface after the complementizer, that, and they certainly cannot cross the clausal boundary and surface with the matrix predicate. So there's clitics that are stuck inside of a clause. They can't cross clausal boundaries. In an argument question or an argument focus construction, clitics can move from the lower predicate onto the argument WH word. So if you want to say who might sing again, you can literally say who again might sing. These are clitics like again that are associated with the lower predicate that can follow the initial WH word. This is an argument that an argument question is actually monoclausal. There's no biclausal structure as a pseudocleft analysis would predict. So in other words, this thing is in fact monoclausal and involves direct displacement. Okay. This claim can be made, well, here's one more argument basically, that this is direct displacement and not an argument and not any kind of pseudocleft. So lastly, a pseudocleft analysis predicts that the initial WH word in this sort of construction is a predicate. It should behave like a predicate. And it does in many Austronesian languages. But in Mondar, it actually does not. We can see this with a pattern of agreement, actually. So there are several types of predicate which do not show agreement in Mondar. So for instance, existential constructions ban agreement. If you say there's a cat outside, you just say there's cat. You can't say there is agreement cat. Nevertheless, in this construction, you can insert a sort of expletive form of agreement. You can insert a morpheme me. We can talk about the precise status of this morpheme later, but the point is many constructions which ban regular agreement, predicates that don't allow regular agreement, do allow this morpheme me. So the claim is, if an argument question involves an argument WH word behaving as a predicate, that WH word should be able to host this predicate-only particle me. Naturally, it cannot. And argument-focused constructions behave the same way. So there are particles that only go on predicates, even when predicates can't take agreement, and these particles cannot appear on initial WH words, initial argument WH words. So this is a final argument that these things, initial argument WH words, are not in fact predicates. They're arguments that have been displaced into the left periphery. This is what 34 shows. There is direct displacement in Mondar. There is no pseudocleft. Now, before I conclude, I would just like to qualify this in a way. So it would be extremely strange, I think, if Mondar were the only language in the entire Austronesian family ever to have direct displacement and everybody else was doing pseudoclefting. But I'd like to suggest that this is probably not the case. And in fact, the overwhelming tendency that Austronesian languages seem to show to prefer WH pseudoclefts is probably just the result of a series of well-placed empirical lacunae. And in particular, many languages in Sulawesi probably resemble Mondar in showing direct displacement of WH words. The other languages that are in Mondar's subfamily, the South Sulawesi languages, likely also all show direct displacement in argument WH questions, as foreshadowed in Finer 97, contrasting abor dependencies in Selayari's. So in other South Sulawesi languages, we can see, just to be very quick, copular constructions show agreement. What is it? This is a sentence in Makassarese. But if you ask any kind of argument WH question, there is no agreement. So what did you eat for breakfast? No agreement. This is just a repeated argument from Mondar that argument questions in other South Sulawesi languages are not actually pseudoclefts, like they are in, for instance, Indonesian, and they involve direct displacement of a WH word. There's sort of parallel morphological evidence that's a little more complicated from other unrelated languages on the island of Sulawesi that we can step through later. So let me just conclude here. I have attempted to show you that there is in fact not a parametric link between verb initial word order / predicate fronting and a ban on direct displacement. So it's been claimed that any language that derives its verb initial word order through predicate fronting will not allow direct displacement of WH words and will instead form argument questions via WH pseudocleft. And this talk has shown that this seems not to be the case in at least one language. So Mondar, a language from central Indonesia again, shows no surface evidence for pseudocleft structure in content questions, in argument questions. There's no evidence that there's copular syntax. There's no evidence that there's a free relative. There's no evidence for biclausal structure. Every diagnostic suggests that there is actually just argument, there's actually just direct displacement of an argument from its thematic position in a WH question in this language. And I think there is probably no deep parametric explanation for this pattern. Austronesian languages show an enormous amount of internal variation. They vary in word order, in voice systems, in patterns of case marking, and who knows what. And it seems very difficult to imagine a single quality which sets Mondar apart from all the other languages which have been claimed to show pseudoclefts, or have been claimed to require WH pseudoclefts and ban direct displacement. We could attribute this to some sort of abstract, like mysterious third parameter, something we have yet to discover. But it seems more likely that there is just not a macroparametric explanation for this. The fact that Austronesian languages behave they do is a reflex of sort of, historical patterns. And the fact that Mondar and potentially other South Sulawesi languages do seem to allow direct displacement is just not grounded in any sort of fundamental fact about their syntax. They just happen to evolve this construction. Thank you. I'll conclude there. There's a bunch of appendices. If anyone.
An excellent talk. Excellent, excellent. One of the best talks I've ever, really, if I may say so, as chair. I should be neutral. All were really brilliant, and I am so interested in this subject. Actually, may I just ask others first? And you can also, of course, be now the master of the universe, of this micro universe of generative grammar, and just ask the people yourself, and then I will ask you also a question if I have still time. So please start asking questions. Discussion is open. I don't know if you see it. So as to the, is there anyone from the discussion participants? go around, or people who are watching us and listening to you who would like to ask questions? It's just, if not, yeah, there is one, of course. What is it? Who is it? Where is it? Ah, yeah, Dan Feng Wu, please ask.
Yeah,
Please.
hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering whether Mandar has pseudoclefs at all involving a copular. I mean, nothing bans it from having that, right?
Yes, thank you, Danfeng. That's a really good question. It is possible to have a certain, there are certain types of, yes, you can have pseudoclefts. It seems like there's a problem with having pseudoclefts in a particular type of argument WH question, but you can in fact, form pseudoclefts. You can say the one who came is this, or like the one who came is Dan. And they do show the expected pattern of agreement that you get in copular clauses.
But then why can't you have a question like who came, or who is the person who came?
That's a very good question. So you can do this with who. So you can form an argument, a WH question with who, sorry, a WH pseudoclef with who. You can say like the one who came. And that does look different. But with inanimates, for some reason, it's not possible. And I'm not entirely sure why. Thank you. It is a mystery.
Maybe I can just drop in. I would like to ask, you were really explaining it in a very, very clear way. And I think that you have shown on the data that there can be a family, so to say, which has very different options. But I can even support your idea, or not idea, it's not idea, it's just empirical data show it, on Romance languages. If you look at French, and the very next language to French is North Italian dialects, Romagnolo, not Toscane, not the standard Italian, because this belongs to the East Romance languages. But the North Italian dialects, my wife, she's from Romagna, she speaks Romagnolo. They have the same construction like que. I know it's not the same thing that we're talking about, but it's also something like, what is it that it is? There were some ideas about the influence of Celtic languages. I did Old Irish. They have exactly the same construction. To ask a simple argument question for something, what is it? What did you do? This you can't say in Italian standard language, Toscane. You do the same like with S, like in Latin. So this is actually another proof. Of course, you could say there it is really the influence of the Celtic language as a substratum of continental Celtic languages like boy, hat, and so on. But I think that it's a proof that this parametric approach, or cartographic approach, can give a lot of insight, but not always explain everything. And the same, you see it everywhere. You see it on the fact that if you have comparison, for example, in Italian and French, this is what Vergniaud already said, this famous example of la femme la plus belle du monde, la più bella donna del mondo. In Italian, it's different. You have copies, maybe silent copies, but why should one? I like your approach because you show that actually one should really, of course, we should always consider, first of all, are there any universal configuration parameters that can derive many different syntactic phenomena from one principle. This is the first thing that you also did. But then you can also assume that maybe it's really a language which has different options. Okay, thank you. This was just a comment. I didn't really ask you something, but I ask others. We have some more, 5 minutes, I think, to go. In your place, it will be something like 11:30, is it? But you are in a different place. You are in California, so it's similar time, or 9 hours difference, like Pacific, plus minus. So if people want to ask, please ask now. We have 5 minutes to go. Very, very, very good talk, I think. Will you publish it? Is it your PhD dissertation, if I may ask you? No?
No. This is a work in progress.
But I hope that you go there sometimes to this. It's a nice place, no? Where you can stay as well. Okay, so we have some. Yeah, there is another Wesley De Santos. So thanks, Dan. Just a comment in Tupi-Guarani languages, you see it, yeah? WH adjuncts force the verb to appear. Maybe you can answer this question.
Right.
Or can say something to it. Thank you for this, Wesley.
Position. This is a lot to take in, but it is deeply fascinating. So, okay. WH arguments are not predicates unless they cannot argue by the clause initial position.
Maybe you should say it loud because no, I don't know if everybody sees it. It goes about Tupi-Guarani. It's one of those languages of 35 languages that I speak that I don't speak. But so the question is, yeah.
Right. Well, so maybe so thank you very much for this comment. Maybe to talk at a more like sort of typological level in general, it is an interesting question whether or not there is actually any correlation between predicate fronting and WH pseudoclefts and an apparent ban on direct displacement in any kind of language outside of Austronesian. So for instance, in Mesoamerica, there's several language families that do show verb initial order, for instance, Ottoman-Gayan languages and Mayan. And there have been proposals that, I mean, most notably in the Ottoman-Gayan world, that verb initial order in these languages does arise through predicate fronting. Nevertheless, I don't think the hypothesis has ever seriously been put forward that argument questions in these languages are pseudoclefts. And in fact, I've been laughed at by Mayanists for suggesting this. So it seems like, and there's a bunch of data on the handout in appendix number 2, if people are riveted to this topic. It seems that this actual correlation between predicate fronting and a restriction on argument WH questions may be something sort of esoteric in Austronesian that at least cannot be straightforwardly, the two properties cannot be straightforwardly linked outside the, outside their iterations across Austronesia.
I just wonder if you have this, you first spoke about these, where you have the pseudoclefts in those languages where you have it, and then you spoke about Manda where it doesn't appear. But how would be your analysis according to things like, Ritzi, the force race and so on? Because there is some work in Germany, on English actually also, that they just take it as a topic phrase, something like that, what I'm talking about. So something like what people do is something like that. So actually, I don't know whether I find the paper that I was just reading. Because of that, I may find it later. But anyway, it's just the question is, if you have these pseudoclefts, how would you analyze them? As to the force phrase from Ritzi. I'm
not entirely sure. There is like substantial disagreement in the literature on English on the structure of pseudoclefts.
Yes.
That's sort of a different talk, but
okay.
There are some questions in the chat.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. So I see a question from Sandy. Thank you for the question, Sandy. The question is, what is your view of macroparametric variation in general? Are there any macro parameters?
Okay.
Well, in a sort of very minimalist worldview, no, I think. I mean, the entire, back in the day of principles and parameters, right? The endeavor was to figure out, our switchboard, like reduce all sorts of linguistic variation to sort of binary points of variation, in a sort of finite parameter space. But we've moved away from this like completely in the sort of minimalist framework where we assume a really pared down version of UG that's actually not rich enough to directly encode these types of generalization. And if that is correct, I mean, the strong minimalist thesis predicts that no, there really should not be macro parameters, and there may be sort of correlations. Like it may be the case that like sure, verb initial languages often do require something like a WH pseudocleft, but that cannot reflect anything sort of deep in UG. It might arise from sort of like tendencies and somewhere along the nebulous path of externalization. But no, there should be no macro parameters directly encoded into UG. Thank you, Sandy.
Actually also supported by the fact what Chomsky says nowadays about externalization facts that are ancillary. They are ancillary mostly. What you see on the PF, you see sometimes it's really just by chance or whatever. It doesn't really reflect the deep, not deep structure, but the architecture of the way how you think. Thank you so much. I just wanted to apologize if I spoke too much today. I just found it so interesting, all the talks that you gave about languages that I have to learn. But anyway, it's very important work, Mike, and I thank you all for this session, all participants who asked questions, all speakers, and I wish you to survive this terrible pandemic, that nobody will be hurt, and to see you next year. Maybe I hope that I still will be also here. I don't even know where is the next conference. Does anybody know? Has it been decided already? Anyway, I was not in last year, but the year before in New York, and there was no pandemic at that time. So I hope that next year I will see you all without any fear and any kind of fear, be it an illness or bad president. Have a good time. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much also, Jackson, for your support and your wonderful technical help, and all of you for your friendliness, being friendly and good linguist. This is very good. This is good. This is a parameter that I believe in. Bye-bye. Dan, it was wonderful what you said. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.